I recently got a chance to speak with Lawrence Schiller about his long and varied career. Even if his name is not familiar to you, Lawrence Schiller is so ubiquitous in American life that you almost certainly have encountered his work at some point. Born in 1936, Lawrence Schiller first achieved notoriety as a photographer for publications like Life and the Saturday Evening Post, making indelible images of people like Marilyn Monroe, Barbra Streisand, and Richard Nixon. Later, Schiller's career branched into books, movies, and other types of media. Schiller is perhaps best known for his legendary collaborations with Norman Mailer on The Executioner Song and Oswald's Tale, among other books. And later, Schiller became a formidable author in his own right, with books like American Tragedy, the definitive insider account of the O.J. Simpson murder trial, and Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, again the best contemporaneous account of the Jonbenet Ramsey murder. We touch on all of this and more in this interview. Thanks for listening. I think one of the first things I wanted to talk to you about was your upbringing and the camera store and sporting goods store that your father ran when you were young. Can you tell me about your early experience with photography and how you sort of came to be involved in taking pictures?
Growing up as a child, I was completely unaware that my father had been a photographer. And in fact, when we moved to San Diego, California from New York in the mid-30s, late or the early 40s, he had a little portrait studio on the main block in San Diego, California, where sailors that were disembarking for the Pacific could have their portraits taken before they left for service in World War II. But I was unaware of that. What I was aware of is that when I became about 10 years old, or 11 or so, in 1946. I was born in 1936. We moved to a community called Pacific Beach, California. And my father opened up a camera, sporting goods, and appliance store. It was kind of like the forerunner of a little Costco or Price Clubs, where he sold cameras, sporting goods, and appliances at a discount rate. And that's when I became more aware of photography. And he gave me a camera on my bar mitzvah, and I had a little dark room in the back of the store where I would develop pictures and so forth. About the age of 13, or around 12 or 13 or 14, I started to ride my bicycle and with my camera around the community. And in those days, you could hear the police band radios on the FM radio channel. So I'd listen to the FM and I'd hear a police signal, well, blah, 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 a certain number. I didn't know what it meant. And it was a street near where I lived, so I'd ride my bicycle there. And there'd be an automobile accident, but the cars would have been towed away. The ambulances would have been gone. The only thing that was left were the skid marks on the street. But what I didn't realize, that by photographing skid marks, and this happened on many occasions, I was learning about lighting. Backlighting would show a skid mark differently than side lighting, or if it was not sunny that day and it was overcast, the lighting would be different. So I started to take pictures of skid marks, and what did I do with the pictures? I sold them to the insurance companies, because insurance companies can tell the speed of a car by a skid mark and can tell exactly where the accident took place. Sometimes it can even tell who was at fault, depending upon the relationship to the crosswalk, to the street, to a driveway, or whatever. And that's how I earned enough money to buy my first car, because my father said, if you earn half the $6,000 it's going to cost to buy a Ford for you, then I'll put in the other half. And that's how I started in photography. And by the time I was in high school, I was doing portraiture, kind of copying the style of Yusuf Karsh and Philippe Halsman, and eventually won photographic awards in a contest called the Graflex Graphic Photographic Awards, and then the Scholastic Photographic Awards, which allowed me to go east at the age of 15 and work as an assistant to Andy Lopez, who was a very famous photographer with Acme News Service. He was to win the Pulitzer Prize on several occasions. So that's how I got started in photography.
Right. And was that, you said your dad was a photographer. Just, I guess what strikes me about your early history is sort of how industrious you were from such an early age. I mean, was that part of your upbringing, or was that something that was unique to you?
No, I think it was part of the surroundings in which I lived. My father was behind the counter. He was a salesman. He used to say, even if the customer is wrong, he's never wrong when he's in this store. He's always right, because as long as the customer is right, he's going to come back and buy something again. Mm-hmm. My mother was the bookkeeper. She kept the books, the accounting, and so forth. At a young age, they would put my brother and I in the movie theater when they were busy across the street. And we'd watch a double feature in those days. But basically, I think the industrialness, the salesmanship, the ideas came from my father being a salesman. He taught me a lot, and I learned a lot. And I think that went a long way into myself learning how to ingratiate myself into other people's lives and how to sell myself for whatever purpose at different times in my life.
Mm-hmm. Is that something that you find difficult? I know personally I often find myself reticent to sell myself. Was that something that you have personal difficulty with, or?
I didn't know anything else but that, so how could I have difficulty with it?
Yeah, that was just sort of.
I mean, I had an accident when I was a child in New York City, and I lost my left eye, the sight in my left eye. I didn't lose the pupil or whatever. The short and long of it, I didn't know. I grew up, what should one say, without sight in a left eye, so I don't know what it is to have sight in two eyes. I just know what it is to have sight in one eye. So, when you grow up a certain way, you don't know what the other is. You have no comparison. It's only when the change takes place, when you are more older and you're used to one aspect and then the other.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because it leads me to a question I wanted to ask. I'd imagine you've probably been asked it before, but I hadn't come across it in any of the interviews, and that's, when you lost the sight in one of your eyes, it seems to me that, that sort of creates a situation where your natural vision is almost exactly like the vision of a camera, in that you're seeing in sort of like mono vision rather than stereo.
You can say that, but I don't know that, because
right,
I have no memory. I have no context. I have no memory of having sight. It happened when I was 6.5 years old, so I don't have any memory of what sight was before.
Right. I guess I was just going to ask.
To me, my sight is normal.
Yeah. I was just going to ask you, though, to reflect that, sort of like when you have somebody who can't see, like Stevie Wonder or Ray Charles, they've said in lots of different biographical works that, maybe upon reflection, maybe having lost that sense brought greater acuity to other senses. And so I'm just wondering if you think in some strange way that having vision in only one eye gave you an advantage as a photographer.
Well, I don't know if it does. I know a magazine once hired me because they knew I had one eye to go photograph a football player who had one eye. And quite successful football player in Seattle. And there's been several occasions where, people have joked about it. I'd be shooting and somebody would say, well, why aren't you closing your left eye like all the photographers do when they look through the camera?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I'd say to them, well, I don't have too good a sight in that eye. I don't have to close it, because when I look through a camera, I don't need to close my left eye.
Mm-hmm.
There's no sight in it.
Yeah. I just think that that's interesting, and it just makes me curious about whether or not that had any impact in terms of, I guess, your first career being a photojournalist, but I guess it sounds like there's a lot of other family influence there, so maybe it was entirely
of course,
natural.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And so, you began working as a photojournalist at a really early age, and published photos in all sorts of big glossy periodicals like Life and Paris Match. And so I wonder if you can tell me about how you got involved in being a photojournalist and traveling around the world.
Well, number one, I lived in Los Angeles. I went to college in L.A. Mm-hmm. And that's when I really started to solicit my pictures, because I lived in a community where things were happening. So I would send picture ideas to magazines. Well, at the beginning, I made a very big mistake, because I'd always say to them, well, I'm 17 years old, or I'm 19 years old, or I'm this or that. And I'd get all these rejects, hundreds and hundreds of rejects. At one point, I used to pin them up on the wall in the bathroom and study them and just try to see, why am I getting all these rejects? And then I kind of realized, why do I have to tell them how good I am at age 19? Just tell them my idea.
Yeah.
And then I started getting the assignments, and I realized people that didn't know my age just assumed that I was old enough or mature enough to go out and take the pictures, and I started getting assignments. So I lived in Hollywood, and I lived, in a community where a lot of things were happening. So I would write to the magazines, and I'd send letters and this and that. Or, I'd make friendships and started to do stories. Well, my first picture in Life magazine was a picture of a young lady by the name of Barbara Bright, who was a tennis player at Wimbledon, who I had photographed, because I used to photograph Southern California tennis in La Jolla, and, Pancho Gonzalez was there. A lot of famous tennis players came out of the West. And Barbara Bright, who was a finalist at Wimbledon, lived in Los Angeles, and I photographed her. So one day we went to this car lot, and I had this idea of putting a dummy upside down as if he was working on the car and she was looking in the car. Well, I shot the picture of the dummy and upside down, and it was a very, very humorous, funny picture. So I sent it into Life magazine, my first picture published in Life, full page. It was called Picture of the Week in the back of the picture. Well, when people saw that, then the next time I would write a letter, I'd say, oh, by the way, did you see my picture in Life magazine, Picture of the Week? I didn't say it was my first picture, you see?
Right, yeah. And I think
did you see my...
Yeah,
Did you see my last picture in Life magazine? That's the phrase I would use. Did you see my last picture in Life magazine? Well, that assumes I've had many more. But it was the last picture, but it was also the first picture, but I didn't make a point of it.
Yeah, that's really clever, and I think that's a big part of salesmanship, isn't it? Is like knowing when not to box yourself in by giving these preambles and qualifiers to things, right?
Right.
Yeah, there's so many sort of iconic images that you're associated with. One of the early images before you sort of started your second incarnation as a movie producer and other things, and a writer, was a photograph after the 1960 election of the Nixons and Richard Nixon and Pat Nixon, and they're obviously very forlorn and crying in the photo, and it just sort of really humanizes Nixon in an odd way. Can you talk a little bit about that photograph?
It was taken at the Ambassador Hotel election night. I was assigned to photograph Nixon for Paris Match magazine. I did his final campaign, and the short and long of it was I wound up being what was known as the pool photographer. Pool photographer means one photographer supplies the work to all photographers in situations where the candidate or they don't allow multiple photographers,
Yeah.
And So I was the pool photographer traveling with Nixon, and, the pictures would be supplied to other news services if they wanted them. Well, that picture was taken in the Ambassador Hotel as like 3 o'clock in the morning when he made his concession speech to JFK. And when I got the assignment for Perry Match said, we're giving you the prime assignment. There's no question Nixon's going to win this election. JFK is a Catholic. Nobody's going to vote for a Catholic in America. And, of course, I thought I had the winner. But, come election night, it sure looked like the election was going to JFK, who I had photographed a little bit, but not the way I had photographed Nixon. And so I made this picture at the Ambassador Hotel about 3 o'clock in the morning of him conceding, even though the electoral votes were not in for all the states. It wasn't until 11 o'clock the next morning, Eastern Time. But the short and long of it was, lo and behold, would I know that in 1968, 8 years later, at that same podium, at that same stage, Robert Kennedy would give his last speech, and I would have that evening made an iconic picture of Robert, a profile of him looking out the window of the plane as he came into Los Angeles.
Yeah, that's another really iconic shot, and that does have an odd synchronicity to it. Did you travel with Nixon then as the pool photographer? Did you get to know him at all?
Oh, yeah. I traveled with him. I don't think I got to know him. We traveled and I photographed him, by the way, in his 62 campaign for governor of California, which he lost to Edwin Brown, and photographed him in 1968 after Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And so I photographed him on many occasions. Nixon was never really warm to the media or the press. Stand there, stand there, stand there. The Kennedys couldn't have cared less where you were, whether you shot them in the front, the rear, or whatever. They believed a lot in freedom of the press. I don't think Nixon believed in the media at all. I think he was scared of the media from day one.
Right, He had a famously contentious relationship with the press, for sure. And
right, sure.
Yeah, so I guess, can you talk a little bit about your experiences photographing RFK then? That seems like a natural thing to talk about.
Well,
what was he like?
I met Robert Kennedy the first time in 1960 at Peter Lawford's house. I had an assignment to photograph Peter Lawford. I went out to Malibu where he had a home, and there he was playing backgammon with Robert Kennedy, who was at that time he had just finished successfully running his brother's campaign, and I think he was Attorney General. And of course, that's where I met. I'd already photographed Marilyn Monroe, by the way,
yep,
in 1960 in a movie called Let's Make Love with Yves Montand. But that's where I met Bobby Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe.
They were there together.
About when well, they weren't actually together at that moment. She was in the house later with a cocktail party, and he was there. But later, I was in 1962, prior to her death. I was at her house one day when Ed Guffman drove Bobby Kennedy to the house and dropped him off there. So, I've never seen them intimately, but I've been together with them,
Yeah, I know. And one thing I wanted to point out is the connection with Peter Lawford is I believe he was married to one of the Kennedy sisters. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. So that's the relationship there.
What did you think about RFK? I mean, how did he seem to you as a person?
Well, I think RFK, let me put it this way. He was a man who was maturing more quickly and catching up with the times after his brother's death. JFK really was not interested in civil rights. Politically, he was interested, but not as a person, if you understand what I'm saying.
Sure.
And neither was Bobby Kennedy at that time. You have to remember that even though he and his brother got Martin Luther King out of jail almost on election night, that in essence their support of civil rights was for political reasons. And Bobby was the one who pushed JFK into making that great civil rights speech more towards the end of his life. But when, Bobby was ruthless in the early days. He was known as ruthless. He worked for Roy Cohn and McCarthy, and as a campaign manager for JFK, he ran a tough campaign. And as Attorney General, he started to become more aware of people's problems firsthand. He supported school integration as Attorney General because that was the law. But did he really support it beyond that? That's a question that only time would answer. But when JFK was assassinated, Bobby knew he wanted to run for U.S. Senator. I don't think he ever thought about those days of becoming president. And he ran and was successful for Senator of the United States. And that's when for New York, and that's when I started to photograph him. I photographed Bobby quite a bit. I was one of his selected photographers on the last campaign. And, he, on his own, started to learn about the problems. I'll give you a little story. I think he was driving with Farmer, one of the civil rights leaders, through Harlem one day. He was, he'd never been to Harlem, and he wanted to see what it was like and understand it as a U.S. Senator. And the short and long of it, a black kid runs up to him, recognizes it's Bobby Kennedy, and puts out his hand and says, "Give me 5." And Bobby kind of pulls back a little bit and turns to Farmer and says, what does he want? Does he want $5 bill or what? I mean, he didn't even understand that "give me 5" was kind of like a feeling of endearment, Yeah. And Farmer looked at him and said, "Well, the word motherfucker is also a word of endearment, So it depends upon." And that was the beginning of Bobby Kennedy. He went and really learned about the plight of the immigrants, and when he went to see Chavez in California, he really took off against Vietnam as Martin Luther King did, and he built his campaign on civil rights. He went to the Delta. He went to South America. He went to South Africa to understand how people wanted to live and how they were living. And he grew and he matured, and I was fortunate enough to be able to photograph him. Look, this is a guy that slept on the floor of the plane when he was tired. I made this picture of him with the Cocker Spaniel sitting on the floor of the plane,
Yeah, it's a great photograph. So I guess maybe I'd like to back up a little bit. Maybe this would be a good time to talk about the other Kennedy brother, JFK. You had a lot of involvement in the aftermath of his assassination. And in fact, there's a short account of your traveling to Dallas that weekend in November of 1963 after hearing about the assassination, and you made some very iconic images that weekend. Can you tell me what that was like?
Well, I was taking a shower in L.A. when my wife, Judy, ran in to me and said, "JFK's just been shot, Larry." And I didn't even blink. The next thing I did is out of the shower. I don't even think I dried off. Grabbed my camera bag, put some clothes on, a California T-shirt, sleeveless, and just drove like a madman all the way out to the airport. And, there were many other media people there by the time I got there. I was not the only one. The short and long of it is that California was closer to Dallas than any other major media city. New York was further away. Chicago was further away. Atlanta was not a media city in those days. So the short and long of it was we were on the plane, and as soon as we got on the plane, we weren't far off. And the pilot came on and announced that it's been announced that JFK had died. And of course, we all knew we were coming into the aftermath. Little did we know that this police department in Dallas was ill-equipped to handle a tragedy of this magnitude. It wasn't New York City or Chicago or San Francisco, which had police forces that were highly trained and highly skilled. And, of course, this was not a Secret Service matter. In that time, the federal law didn't exist. It was a city and state matter. JFK was killed. He was a man, and so it was the police department. And when I landed, I went directly to the Dallas Police Department to the third floor, where it was just a crush. There were hundreds and hundreds of people. And I was there, and I passed the elevator. And just as I passed the second elevator, I got out of one, the elevator opened, and there was Lee Harvey Oswald. So I turned around with my Leica and the 21-millimeter lens, and I was almost one of the first photographers ever to photograph Oswald. But what I realized sometime later, because the adrenaline was going, and you were just on autopilot at that point, is that here was a man who was only 2 years younger than me. I was 26.
Wow.
Oswald was 24. And here's a man who had, done this evil act, a horrible situation at 24. And I had thought of only mature people doing evil things. Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini. I'd never, as a young man, thought of evil coming out of a young person. So I didn't even know what an assassination was.
Yeah.
Even though the 60s would be the wild, wild west, and we would experience 5 assassinations in the 60s. Malcolm X, Edgar Evers, Bobby Kennedy, JFK, Martin Luther King. America was dropping acid in the 60s. We were saying, make love, no war. We were at Woodstock. We had Nixon running for president. It was the wild, wild west, and America was not prepared for that decade.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that the camera that you're using, because that was something that I was going to ask you as a follow-up. And the reason why I'm really curious, and I'm also glad that you mentioned that you're using a 21-millimeter lens, because that basically answered my follow-up question.
That was one of the cameras I had.
Right, but
I had three cameras around my neck.
The reason I wanted to ask you about that, though, is that the quality of those photos, especially in the police department hallways and of Marguerite and Marina Oswald showing up, is almost surreal. And I think some of that might be a quality of the wide-angle lens that you're using. I'm assuming that you were using that lens because you were in cramped quarters in that crush of people. Is that correct?
Nope. Completely wrong.
Oh.
Number one, the quality of the photographs is based upon really understanding the technology and just not being a news photography. Most people would push the film, overdevelop it, so they could use a higher shutter speed and get more depth of field. I would overexpose my pictures and underdevelop it. I did just the opposite, because that would give me more detail in the shadows. When you would have a strong contrasty light, what you really needed was the detail in the shadows.
Okay.
And, of course, that's what I understood technologically. The second reason that I used the 21-millimeter lens, and also the 35, in the hallway, and there are times I even used the longer lens, was because you wanted the feeling of presence. You wanted to feel you were close to the person. It wasn't because it was cramped. It was because you wanted to feel the pores on their skin. You wanted the distortion in the picture so that it felt, not only looked like, but felt that you were right next to them.
Yeah, that's certainly the impression I get when looking back at those photographs. You said you had 3 cameras. Did you mostly shoot with Leicas, or what kind of gear were you using?
Well, in that hallway, I had 3 Leicas. There's movie footage of me and so forth. And I had 3 Leicas. I had 21 millimeter super angle on, I think, on the Leica, 35 millimeter Summicron, and a 90 millimeter Summicron. I also had a Nikon with a 180 millimeter sonar f2.8 lens, but I didn't use that in the hallway. I used that on other occasions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Was that, what would that be used more for, like a portrait or something like that, or?
Well, when you couldn't get something close and you wanted to bring it close to you, you know.
Yeah, okay. And you know, in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, you took on a few different roles in the media. You were, I believe, an expert for CBS News, where you made a recreation of the famous photograph of Oswald holding the magazine and the rifle in the backyard, and essentially made a demonstration proving that the shadows weren't inconsistent. Can you tell me how you got involved in that with CBS?
Well, you see, this is an interesting thing because this photograph was very controversial. The nose shadow under Oswald in the picture taken by Marina, which they never found the negative, they only found a print, which led to more speculation. And the nose shadow is directly down to the center of his lip. But the body shadow and all the other shadows in the picture go at an angle. You see, go at a slight angle. People thought this was a head that was superimposed on a picture and added to all the conspiracy theories, you see. And so I decided, I was working a little bit for CBS, and I proposed to them, why don't we recreate this picture, you know? And, well, the thing is, you had to wait 4 years to recreate it. Why couldn't you just recreate it tomorrow? Because the solar system had to be in the same position as it was on the day that Marina took the picture of Oswald. So I had to wait 4 years for the solar system to be in the same position and hope that it would not be cloudy that day.
Wow.
Which it wasn't. Yeah. And then I recreated it on Polaroid so that nobody could say, I superimposed on, and I had to get somebody wearing almost the same type of clothes, almost the same height, and with a gun, and I recreated it, and I proved that the head in a certain position does produce a vertical nose shadow while everything else is at an angle.
Right, yeah, that was a very effective demonstration. You also, I believe it was like 66 or 67, worked on a book called The Scavengers and Critics of the Warren Report, and I wonder how you got involved in that.
Well, you see, I was already starting to do things besides photography. I was researching Lenny Bruce. I was making documentary records for Capitol Records, where I was doing interviews, you know, homosexuality in the American male, why did Lenny Bruce die, LSD, all these life essays that I was doing on various subjects. I very much, you know, would say, well, maybe I'd make a documentary record, maybe I do this, maybe I do a book. I wasn't satisfied with just taking pictures. You know, once I was asked, well, Mr. Schiller, what do you call yourself? And I said, I'm a communicator. I can take pictures, I can do interviews, I can do this, and eventually I would hire great writers to write books based on my interviews. Albert Goldman wrote Ladies and Gentlemen, Lenny Bruce. I hired him to write that book, collaborated with him, and, you know, became a Broadway play and contributed to the movie with Dustin Hoffman. Then I would hire writers like Norman Mailer to write on Marilyn Monroe, to go with photographs by 24 of the world's photographers. And then I started doing photographic books. So, you know, I was not interested in only being a photojournalist. I was interested in telling stories any way I could in any media. Of course, we didn't have the word media at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned the Capitol Records project. I think you're alluding to the interview with Jack Ruby.
Well, that was on one of the records, the controversy.
Yeah.
And, you know, that was done because Elmer Gertz, one of Jack Ruby's attorneys, called me, and I was kind of more well known at that point, and I'd done some pretty interesting interviews, and I can't remember why, but Elmer Gertz, who was Clarence Darrow's law partner, called me and said, Jack's very sick in the hospital, and et cetera, and Jack wants to pay his income tax before he dies. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting. He says, well, he needs some money. And I said, well, if I did an interview, maybe I could sell the interview or raise some money. And without going through all the steps, the short and long of this, I did one of the last interviews, or arranged to have it done in Parkland Hospital, which I then did a documentary album for Capitol, which was not to sell, but to put on radio stations. And it contained the last interview with Jack Ruby.
Mm-hmm. What did you think of him as a person? What was he like, Jack Ruby?
Nebbish.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that he was put up to shooting Oswald, or it's based on what I've read, it seems like it was sort of on a whim, but what do you think about it?
I don't deal in speculation and rumors. Sorry, I won't go down that road.
Okay, yeah, no problem. You've mentioned a couple other really interesting things, like the LSD project and a bunch of other stuff. I think that's fairly well covered in other places. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking to you about the Executioner song, the collaboration with Norman Mailer, mainly because I spent a lot of the past week rereading it. And I guess what's really interesting to me about that project is that story about Nicole Barrett wanting to kill herself, do the suicide pact with Gary Gilmore. Just struck you.
Wait. She didn't want to kill herself. Gary Gilmore talked her into killing herself.
Right. Yeah.
Taking her life at the same time he would take his life. So that's not her wanting to kill herself.
Right. Yeah.
That's her being manipulated, you understand, by Gilmore.
Right. Yeah. I sorry for my inaccurate phrasing there. I guess I just was struck that when you read that newspaper article about Nicole Barrett and how Gilmore had manipulated her into the suicide pact, that you sort of immediately knew that it was a story that you'd be interested in. And I'm just curious.
What interested me in the story was not only that, but the fact that she had two children under a certain age that were found lying next to her bed, if my memory is right, or near her.
Yeah.
And that's what said to me again, how could somebody convince a young girl to take her life when she had two children whose lives that she was responsible for? So that's what first interested me in the article. And of course, when I finally went to Utah, I saw that this was a much, much bigger story. And originally I was going to make a movie, and I said, God damn it, forget the movie. First I had to ingratiate myself into the Gilmore group. First I had to interview Gilmore. I had to gain the trust of everybody. And I spent almost 9 months researching the story 5 days a week. And, I remember once I was talking to Vern D'Amico, Gilmore's uncle, and he said to me something, I'm going to paraphrase. He says, well, David Susskind called me, and he told me that, he's the Dallas Cowboys, and you're just a high school football team. And I said, well, yeah, David Susskind is a very big producer, and he is like the Dallas Cowboys, Mr. D'Amico. But I'm here. I'm suited up. I'm on the field ready to play. Where's he? He's in an office building in New York City.
Right.
I got the rights, you see?
Yeah. And I was reading an interview that you did in the Mailer Review, looking back on the Executioner song, and in it you explore with the interviewer, sort of why you're attracted or interested in antisocial behavior. And it just strikes me now, as you were talking about Ms. Barrett, that is sort of like the ultimate antisocial behavior in a way, is killing yourself as a mother with young children. Do you think that might be part of why you're interested in the story?
No, I was interested in the story for so many different reasons. And why does a guy who spent half his life in prison want to be executed? You'd think that he wants to get out of prison. He wants to convince the jury to be lenient. No, there were lots of motives. The contrast between religion, the Mormon religion, and that, you die to go to a better life in the afterlife. Well, here they are convicting Gilmore and sentencing them to death. So are they sentencing him to a better life in the afterlife? I mean, there were so many issues, far beyond that I could even, think through.
Yeah.
That's why I knew that if I was to obtain everything and spend the information, I'd then have to go out and get a great writer to write it, a writer who'd been run over by enough trucks in his life that he understood everything. I was still, unequipped as a writer to write that type of book. Later on, I would write, American Tragedy, which was the account of the O.J. Simpson case with James Woolworth of Time magazine. But in those days, I was reaching out to great writers.
Right, and you secured Norman Mailer's participation to write the book eventually. And when I read,
you have to remember that's the third book he wrote for me.
Right.
That wasn't the first book he wrote for me. You see?
Right. You guys had previously collaborated on the book about Marilyn Monroe, and then another book about graffiti art.
That's correct.
And so, I was just going to comment though that when you read a lot of Mailer's other writing, it's a lot more, I guess, ornate. His prose,
right.
And in the Executioner song, I think I've heard Mailer describe it like he was channeling the story, and I actually really believe that after having read it a couple times. I mean, the writing is so spare and sort of evocative.
Well, but he took his voice out of the book.
Yeah.
That's the great bold thing that Mailer did. In the middle of his career as a highly successful writer, using his voice, being the provocateur, he makes this turn, and he uses the voice of the West, and steps aside, and writes the book, using those voices rather than writing about himself experiencing it as he had done in his previous Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Armies of the Night, where he writes about himself in the third person. But here, and then there was a big decision of how to include me in the book, because I was part of that story.
Right.
And I said, let's go to it. Tear me to pieces. Be critical of me. Forget about the fact, that I asked you to write the book. And I gave him interviews, and I said, all is fair in love and war. And add writing to it.
Yeah, and right, and I've heard other people describe your portrayal in that book as being less than charitable, or sort of making you out to be sort of like a barracuda, is mentioned in one review. But I actually think that.
Well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that if it's factually correct in some ways? And what's wrong if it's an interesting character that the audience wants to vest themselves in and find out about it? That's what writing is about.
Yeah, no, but
writing is to make it is good. So that is how he perceived me, and he has a right to his opinion.
But what I was going to say though is that it may be my own bias speaking, but I think you come off incredibly good in the book. Mailer does a really amazing job of detailing these clever maneuvers that you make, things that you've learned over the years of doing this kind of stuff, like not having your messages sent to the hotel, but rather getting a temporary secretary at a Walgreens, so that people could call locally. Just things like that. I mean, it just really strikes me.
Well, that just comes from experience. You got to remember, I'm doing that story in '76.
Yeah.
And I started as a photojournalist in '59 and '60. Well, I got 25 years under my belt, or how many years? The '60s. So I got 16 years under my belt.
Yeah.
You got to learn something in 16 years.
No, and but I guess I just wanted to ask you if because one of the best parts about that book, and one of the sort of almost characters, is the setting of Utah and this sort of underworld of Jack Mormons. I wonder if you were familiar with that world at all before encountering the story.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Wasn't familiar with that world at all, and that's what makes it interesting, the sense of discovery.
Yeah.
Discovery for me in doing the interviews, discovery for Mailer in writing it, and of course Mailer had the skills to do it. And as Mailer later would write, Schiller had the skills to do the interviews, unlike anybody else could do. And this is not the only book that I've provided writers. Mailer and I went and did Oswald's Tale together. Years later, we spent 9 months in the Soviet Union. And then I did the Robert Hansen book, Into the Mirror, which was more a fictional novel, because it had already been a great biography of that event written by a Washington Post reporter. So I decided to approach it slightly different. And the short and long of it is, each project you approach differently. You say, what can I do different about this than I've done it before? I don't want to just be on an assembly line and knock out the same type of thing all the time. There's nothing exciting about that in life. There's no sense of discovery.
Right. I wonder, after doing the Executioner song, if your feelings about stuff like the death penalty or the way that criminal justice was administered in this country changed at all.
I don't really discuss my own feelings.
Sure.
That way. I will say one thing, that during the event I did not want Gilmore to be executed. I actually thought there's a better story if the man rises to that occasion, becomes what he is, and then he's not executed, and he just fades back into death row as another number. I felt that was more of a dramatic ending as I was doing the story. Of course, either ending would have been extraordinary to that story.
Yeah, that book, it commented on so many things, and I think one salient detail to talk to the audience about is that nobody had been executed in America for 10 years at that point. There was a moratorium on the death penalty. So that book sort of really ignited a conversation and a debate amongst people about the nature of the death penalty. So,
right.
Yeah, I don't want to skip around a whole lot, but you did mention Oswald's Tale, and I would like to talk to you about that experience a little bit, if you don't mind. How did that opportunity come about? It was because the Soviet Union had opened up, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, what you have to realize is that I had spent time in the Soviet Union producing and directing a film called Peter the Great.
Right.
And so I understood a little bit about the Soviet Union as a neophyte. And when the wall came down, I was actually working on a film on Chernobyl. But when the wall came down, I realized there were 3 or 4 great stories that America did not know that was in the archives of the KGB, and that was the Alger Hiss story, and then the Rosenberg story, the spies for Russia that were executed in the United States, and then there was Oswald's years in the Soviet Union. I sent a fax to the head of the KGB and saying that there were these three great stories, and I would like to come and have access to the KGB files and do these stories. I mean, I was already known in the Soviet Union, already liked. Gorbachev had invited me to the Soviet Union when he announced perestroika. My film had been well received, 6 months later, I get an answer to that fax. Mr. Schiller, I can tell you quite honestly that Alger Hiss did not in any way work or was associated with the Soviet Union. Lee Harvey, the Rosenbergs, you know everything about him, and everything you know is correct, meaning the country. Okay.
Yeah.
Lee Harvey Oswald, I'm paraphrasing, obviously the facts I got back. Lee Harvey Oswald, we're prepared to receive you and discuss the matter. So that was me going to the Soviet Union, and I asked Norman if he was interested in the project, and he seemed to be, and we went on an exploratory trip, Oswald's tale speaks for itself. That's a whole interview unto itself.
Right, yeah, for sure. Just one small aspect of that I'd like to touch on before we move on is that based upon my reading of the accounts of that collaboration, it sounds like that probably was the most time that you got to spend with Mailer. Is that accurate?
Well, on a day-to-day basis, yes. We were living together, working together, but I spent 35 years with him. I spent much time in his home and working with him on projects, screenplays. He wrote screenplays for me,
right,
too. So I worked with Norman quite a bit.
Yeah, and I just want to mention at this point too that you're the president of the Norman Mailer Center, and you do a writers' colony. On behalf of the center, can you tell me a little bit about what that's like?
Well, when Norman died, Norris, his wife, who has since also passed on, decided that they should turn the home, Norman's home, in Provincetown into a colony for writers to learn about writing. And Norman had always wanted to do that himself, but had never done it. So that's what we did. We took Norman's home and turned it in to a nonprofit. And the center was, 8 or 9 years. And then Norris died, and the children, Norman had, I think, 8 or 9 kids by 6 different wives. They decided to sell the house, which kind of defeated the purpose of the Mailer, column center. So the center exists now, but it takes place at Wilkes University and UCross and various other locations, around the country. It's not centrally located in Provincetown where it was before.
Right. Gosh, there's just so many things I'd love to talk to you about. I don't want to take a whole lot more of your time, but there's a couple more things I wanted to touch on. How did you get involved in the O.J. Simpson case?
Well, this is, again, part coincidence. I knew Robert Kardashian personally. He and I were friends for many years. His wife knew my wife, and I knew all the girls when they were born, taking baby pictures of them or everything. I mean, Kimmy I know, and all the girls, and Robert Jr., they had a problem when O.J. was arrested, and they had this crush of media and everything, and Robert called and asked whether I could help them out, and, they needed some financial resources because O.J. had lots of properties and pension plans, but he really had no cash. And I did the first book, I Want to Tell You, which was a response to the letters he was receiving in prison. And then I had the ability and the right to write my own book called American Tragedy, which was the inside story of the Simpson case, which became a New York Times bestseller, which I wrote after.
Right, you wrote that with a journalist from, I think, the Time magazine, James Woolworth.
Yeah, James wrote about what took place in the courtroom because he was sitting there every day, and I wrote what took place outside of the courtroom, which was the behind-the-scenes stuff, and then I put it all together into one book.
Yeah, one aspect of that case I'm especially fascinated with is the Furman tapes, and it's my understanding that you were the person that was able to edit those and sort of unlock their evidentiary potential. Did you know when you first got a hold of those that those were going to be an important part of the trial?
Of course we knew. Of course, all you have to do is listen to them once, and you know not only the value of it, but the importance of it. You know that he had misrepresented the facts, that he was in some ways potentially a racist. You know.
Yeah, and I'm just curious. Did Hart McKinney approach you, the woman that made those tapes?
No. She approached the defense completely, and the defense knew. Robert knew I was a motion picture producer and director, and I knew about sound, and I knew how to handle the tapes. You know, so they could be completely understood by a jury. You know.
Yeah. You know, I've tried to find where one might be able to listen to the tapes, because I just would love to be able to hear the full length of them. Only a short.
They're not available because the intellectual property rights to them are owned by the young lady who did it. You know.
Yeah, Laura Hart McKinney. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, got another great book that you did, and another notorious media event was the Jonbenet Ramsey killing in Colorado.
Well, that came about after the O.J. Simpson case, and I had done that. Tina Brown, who was a friend of mine, who is now the editor of the New Yorker, said to me, you know, Larry, we'd like you to go to Colorado and do a cover story on this case. I didn't even know about it, to be frank with you, until she called me, and then I said, Tina, I'd love to. I think I can do great interviews and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, I'm very, very busy. I don't know if I could write this story fast enough for a magazine because I'm a little slow doing that. And she says, oh, don't worry, I'll give you Gore Vidal's editor. And so that's how I did the thing. And, you know, then I wound up doing a book after I wrote the New Yorker article. But my first, you know, was the New Yorker article.
Right. The book Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, which, like a lot of your other projects, also got turned into a miniseries.
Yep.
And to me, that book is, you know, pretty much the best contemporaneous account. And, you know, I guess what I find interesting is that you mentioned that you weren't really aware of it at the time. Was that a story that you felt as drawn to as, say, like the Gilmore case, or what did you find interesting about that case?
Well, the fact that everybody was accusing the parents of the murder without any evidence at all, only because they were the easy target, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that your book and that whole case really sort of sheds a lot of light on the way the media works, and can sometimes, you know, especially, you know, tabloid type journalism can sort of warp the perception of a case. I just wonder if you had any comment on that.
Well, that the parents being targeted was a product of the tabloid medium. I'm not saying that they did everything perfect. You know, they made some missteps, and they may have had the wrong advice in certain aspects. But the short and long of the whole thing was that, you know, there was no evidence against the parents, and, you know, the tabloids went after it, and the police followed. The book speaks for itself, and I think it's interesting reading, you know?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Just wanted to, before we end this interview, I just wanted to mention that at the sixth floor museum at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, you have an exhibit that's going on right now called Rebel Spirits, Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., an exhibition of photos that's open till September 3rd. Can you tell me anything about that?
Well, last year I curated the Smithsonian exhibition on JFK for the Kennedy family, and also produced the opening night event with a lot of important entertainers and other people like that. And that exhibit went to the New York Historical Society after that. And it was so successful that when this came about, the anniversary of the tragedy,
Yeah.
The short and long of it is several people came to me and said, would you curate an exhibit of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy? And I said, of course, I would. And so that's how that came about. And then I wound up doing a book, as I do most of the times, with David Margolin called The Promise and the Dream,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Two more quick questions. You mentioned in an interview with Charlie Rose after the O.J. verdict that you were planning on writing an autobiography. Is that still in the works?
Oh, yeah, of course, sure.
Any information about when it may be released or what it might contain?
Well, I think it'll be towards the end of next year. We're working on it, kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that has to just be quite the project to undertake. I mean, we just briefly touched on a lot of different things. The last thing I wanted to ask you is, was there any other projects that you wanted to give a plug to, or anything else you're working on that you wanted to mention?
No. It's really about, when the projects come out, they kind of speak for themselves.
Yeah.
Which is what it should always be about. And I enjoyed this interview, and I thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Schiller.